November 1942. A 100-ton American destroyer charges straight at a 36,000-ton Japanese battleship. The captain knows this is suicide. His crew knows this is suicide. Every law of naval warfare says the smaller ship should turn and run. But Lieutenant Commander William Hank does something insane. He orders his 5-inch guns to open fire. 7 minutes later, the battleship's bridge is destroyed. The admiral is wounded. The chief of staff is dead. And a 55-pound shell has just changed the entire Pacific War. This is not a story about battleships. This is not a story about aircraft carriers. This is a story about a shell. A projectile that weighed less than a small child, but could rip a 2,000-ton warship apart like wet cardboard. A weapon that American engineers designed in 1933, while the Japanese were building what they believed were the finest destroyers in the world. They were wrong. Dead wrong. And 267 Japanese sailors would pay for that miscalculation with their lives in just 3 minutes of combat. But before we get there, we need to understand how America built the perfect destroyer killer. The year is 1941, December 7th. Pearl Harbor is burning. The Pacific Fleet lies in ruins. Japanese aircraft have just demonstrated that naval warfare has changed forever. But the real nightmare for American sailors is just beginning. In the months that follow, Japanese destroyers will become the terror of the South Pacific. These sleek predators rule the night. They carry the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon so advanced that American naval intelligence refuses to believe it exists. The Long Lance can travel 20 miles at 50 knots. American torpedoes can barely manage half that range at slower speeds. Japanese destroyer crews have trained for years in night combat. Their massive 20-power binoculars can spot American ships in total darkness before American radar can detect them. Their doctrine is simple and terrifying. Charge into enemy formations under cover of darkness. Launch spreads of devastating torpedoes. Disappear before the enemy can react. And it works. August 9, 1942. The Battle of Savo Island. A Japanese cruiser force catches an Allied squadron completely off guard. In less than 1 hour, 4 Allied cruisers are sinking. Over 1,000 men are dead or dying in the oil-slicked waters. It is the worst naval defeat in American history. The Japanese lose 0 ships. The pattern repeats again and again. At Tassafaronga, Japanese destroyers turn the tables on a numerically superior American force. They sink 1 cruiser and cripple 3 more while losing only a single ship. American admirals are desperate. The Tokyo Express, the nightly Japanese supply runs to Guadalcanal, seems unstoppable. Japanese destroyers deliver troops and supplies with impunity. They bombard Henderson Field. They evacuate garrisons. They do whatever they want because they own the night. Something has to change. Someone has to find a way to stop these ships. And that someone is not an admiral or a famous captain. That someone is a group of engineers working in a building most Americans have never heard of. The Bureau of Ordnance sits in Washington, D.C., a boring government building filled with men who spend their days calculating muzzle velocities and penetration angles. In 1933, these engineers faced an impossible problem. The Navy needed a gun that could do 2 completely different jobs. It needed to shoot down aircraft diving at 300 miles per hour from changing altitudes. It also needed to punch holes in enemy warships at ranges up to 10 miles. No gun in the world could do both. Aircraft required rapid fire at high angles. Ships required heavy shells fired flat and fast. The conventional wisdom said you needed 2 different weapons. The Bureau of Ordnance said no. They would build 1 gun that did everything. Their solution would become legendary. The 5-inch 38 caliber Mark 12 gun. The designation told you everything you needed to know. 5 inches was the diameter of the shell. 38 calibers meant the barrel was 38 times that diameter, 190 inches of rifled steel tube just over 15 feet long. But the real genius was invisible. The gun used semi-fixed ammunition. The shell and powder charge were separate, allowing faster loading than traditional bagged powder systems. But the shell could still be heavy enough to do real damage. At 55 pounds, it carried enough explosive to tear through light armor and detonate inside the target. The muzzle velocity was 600 feet per second. That meant the shell arrived on target in seconds. No time to evade, no time to react, and the rate of fire separated it from every competitor in the world. With a well-trained crew, the 5-inch .38 could fire 22 rounds per minute. One shell every 2.7 seconds. Sustained. For hours. The power ramming system meant shells could be loaded at any angle of elevation, perfect for tracking aircraft. Equally deadly against surface targets. When the first 5-inch .38 guns went to sea aboard USS Farragut in 1934, American destroyer captains finally had a weapon that could match anything in the world, but nobody knew it yet. The true test would not come for another 8 years. While American engineers perfected their gun, Japanese engineers were building ships they believed were invincible. The Fubuki-class destroyer sliced through the waves in 1928 like nothing the world had ever seen. Every major navy sent intelligence officers to photograph her. What they saw was terrifying. Twin turrets fully enclosed against weather and blast. 6 5-inch guns instead of 4. 9 torpedo tubes carrying those deadly long lance torpedoes. Night fighting equipment that made Japanese crews masters of darkness. Speed exceeding 35 knots. The Fubukis and their successors represented a quantum leap in destroyer design. Japanese naval doctrine called for these ships to be offensive weapons, not mere escorts. They would charge into enemy battle lines, overwhelm them with torpedo attacks, and vanish into the night. But there was a problem. A fatal problem. To achieve such incredible performance while staying within treaty displacement limits, Japanese engineers had to cut weight everywhere possible. They used welded construction instead of riveted. Faster to build, but less resistant to blast damage. They employed lightweight aluminum alloys for superstructures, and they made the hulls thin, very thin. The hull plating on Japanese destroyers averaged just 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, about the thickness of a car door. This was not entirely foolish. Destroyers were never meant to trade blows with battleships or cruisers. Their defense was speed and darkness. A destroyer caught in a gunnery duel had already lost. The thin hulls made sense in the tactical doctrine of the 1920s and 1930s. But that doctrine was about to encounter something its designers never imagined. Night battles at ranges so close that destroyer fought destroyer. Where torpedoes did not matter. Where rapid-fire guns decided who lived and who died. Where there was nowhere to run, and no time to evade. The 5-inch common shell, officially designated Mark 12 Common, was not designed to crack battleship armor. It was designed as a compromise. Tough enough to penetrate cruiser armor, enough explosive to devastate unarmored targets. The shell body was forged from high-grade steel, hardened and tempered to exact specifications. Unlike pure armor-piercing shells, which were almost solid metal, the common shell carried 3.2 pounds of explosive D, about 6% of its total weight. The nose was designed to remain intact when hitting armor up to 5 inches thick. It would drive through before the base detonator triggered the explosive charge. The timing was everything. 0.01 to 0.005 seconds after impact. That delay was critical. When the shell hit a Japanese destroyer thin hull, it did not explode on contact. The hardened nose punched through the 1/2-inch plating like paper. The shell penetrated into interior spaces, machinery rooms, crew quarters, ammunition storage. And then it detonated. The explosion occurred inside the ship. The blast wave had nowhere to go but outward through more thin plating. The interior became a killing zone. Often the explosion blew out sections of hull on the opposite side of the ship. Against heavy battleship armor, the shell would crater and break up. Against no armor at all, it might pass through without detonating. But against light armor, the kind found on Japanese destroyers, the common shell was perfectly matched to its target. It penetrated. Then, it exploded. August 1942. Guadalcanal becomes the testing ground. A malarial jungle island that nobody had heard of suddenly becomes the most contested real estate in the Pacific Ocean. Control of Henderson Field. A crude airstrip carved out of the jungle means control of the surrounding seas. Both sides will pay any price to hold it. The first real test comes in the darkness. American destroyers equipped with the new Mark 37 fire control system begin engaging Japanese ships at night. The Mark 37 can calculate firing solutions faster than any human. Radar can find targets in pitch darkness. And the 5-inch 38 can deliver 55 pounds of steel and high explosive every 3 seconds. The results are shocking. At the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, USS Laffey engages the battleship Hiei at point-blank range, under 2,000 yards. Her 5-inch guns hammer the battleship's superstructure. Shell after shell punches through the light armor, protecting the bridge, the fire control stations, the radio rooms. One shell penetrates near Admiral Abe and detonates. He staggers wounded. His chief of staff falls dead. Hiei is blinded. Her command is disrupted. She will be finished off by aircraft the next day. But something even more devastating happens when American guns turn on Japanese destroyers. The thin-hulled ships begin to come apart, not just damaged. Splitting open. Hulls peeling like aluminum cans crushed in a fist. Entire sections of superstructure disintegrating into shrapnel. The common shells penetrate with ease and explode inside. Steam pipes carrying superheated steam rupture filling compartments with invisible death. Fuel lines break spraying flammable oil onto hot metal. Men die by the dozens from single hits. The Japanese had spent a decade building destroyers they believed were superior to anything America possessed. They dominated every night battle in these waters. But they made one critical miscalculation. They built their ships light. Too light. And now, American metallurgy was meeting Japanese naval architecture in the most violent way possible. The survivors described the experience as being inside a bell when it struck. The shell punches through the outer hull with a sound like a giant rivet gun. Then comes the penetration through interior spaces. Men in the path are killed instantly, even before detonation. Then comes the explosion. The blast wave ruptures organs, collapses lungs. Shell fragments rip through bulkheads, slice through pipes, shred equipment. The accumulation of smoke, steam, and toxic gases makes damage control nearly impossible. Japanese destroyers lack the sophisticated systems of American ships. A single hit in the right place can be crippling. 3 or 4 hits can be fatal. The age of Japanese destroyer supremacy is ending. The Americans are learning how to win. But this is only the beginning. In Part 2, we will see the night that American destroyers achieved the perfect battle. 0 American casualties. 0 damage. 2 Japanese destroyers sent to the bottom in 32 minutes. The weapon nobody believed in was about to change everything. In Part 1, we saw how American engineers created a weapon nobody believed could work. A 55-pound shell designed to do 2 impossible jobs at once. We saw how Japanese destroyers, the terror of the Pacific, began to come apart when American guns found their range. We saw the thin hulls splitting open like aluminum cans. But proving a weapon works in scattered engagements is one thing. Convincing the entire United States Navy to change how they fight is something else entirely. In the months following Guadalcanal, American destroyer losses continued to mount. 23 destroyers sunk in 1942 alone. Thousands of sailors dead. The Tokyo Express kept running. Japanese destroyers kept winning night battles. And despite the promising results, most American admirals remained convinced that the key to victory was more battleships, more aircraft carriers, more of everything, except better destroyer tactics. The 5-inch 38 was proving itself in combat. But the men who controlled the Navy refused to listen. And this is where everything got worse. The problem was not the weapon. The problem was doctrine. American naval thinking in 1942 was dominated by what sailors called The Gun Club. These were admirals who had risen to power, believing in one thing above all else. Big guns win naval battles. Battleships with 16-inch rifles. Cruisers with 8-inch guns. These were the weapons that mattered. Destroyers were escorts, screen elements. Their job was to protect the big ships from submarines and aircraft. The idea that destroyers could be primary combat weapons seemed absurd to men who had spent their careers dreaming of massive fleet engagements. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was typical of this thinking. He commanded amphibious forces in the Solomons and had lost ships at Savo Island. His response was not to embrace new destroyer tactics. His response was to demand more cruiser support, more battleship coverage. The destroyers should stay back and screen. Let the heavy ships do the fighting. When reports came in showing the effectiveness of 5-inch fire against Japanese destroyers, Turner was skeptical. The Japanese losses could be explained by luck, by surprise, by poor Japanese seamanship, not by some magical property of American shells. Captain William Friesman had seen the results firsthand. He had commanded a destroyer division at Guadalcanal. He had watched his ships tear Japanese destroyers apart at close range. He knew the 5-inch .38 was a war-winning weapon if employed correctly. But when he presented his analysis to Turner, the admiral was dismissive. "These are isolated incidents," Turner said. "The Japanese had superior torpedoes, superior night fighting training. The only way to beat them was to avoid night engagements entirely. Control the air, control the day, let the battleships handle surface combat." Friesman pressed his case. The data showed clear patterns. Japanese destroyers were vulnerable to rapid gunfire at close range. Their thin hulls could not withstand the common shell. American fire control systems gave them an edge the Japanese could not match. Turner cut him off. "I have been fighting naval battles since before you were born. I know what works and what does not. Your theory is interesting, but I will not risk ships on a theory." The meeting ended. Friesman was warned that pushing his ideas too aggressively could damage his career. The Navy did not reward officers who challenged established doctrine, but Friesman could not let it go. Every night, Japanese destroyers ran the Tokyo Express. Every night, American sailors died. And he knew there was a better way. He just needed someone with enough authority to listen. That someone arrived in October 1943. His name was Arleigh Burke, a captain who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the entire United States Navy. But in 1943, he was just a destroyer squadron commander with a reputation for aggressive tactics and unconventional thinking. Burke had studied the same battle reports that Friesman had analyzed. He had reached the same conclusions. The 5-inch .38 gun combined with radar fire control gave American destroyers a decisive advantage in close-range night combat. The Japanese could not match American rate of fire. They could not match American fire control accuracy, and their thin-hulled ships could not survive concentrated hits from common shells. Burke did something no other senior officer had done. He listened. He studied the technical data. He ran calculations, and he designed a new tactical doctrine built entirely around the capabilities of the 5-inch .38. His destroyers would not hang back and screen. They would attack. They would close to effective gun range before the Japanese could launch torpedoes. They would overwhelm enemy destroyers with rapid, accurate fire, and they would win. But Burke needed to prove it. Not in a theoretical exercise, not in a staff presentation. He needed a real battle. A victory so complete that even the gun club admirals could not ignore it. He got his chance on November 25, 1943. The Battle of Cape St. George. The night was dark. Overcast skies blocked the moon. Rain squalls swept across the waters north of Bougainville. Perfect conditions for a Japanese supply run. Intelligence reported 5 Japanese destroyers heading toward Buka to evacuate troops. Burke had 5 destroyers of his own. Destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers. His crews had trained relentlessly for this moment. Every gun crew knew their weapon. Every fire control officer understood the Mark 37 system. Every captain had studied Burke's tactical doctrine. They were ready. At 1:41 a.m., radar contact. 5 Japanese ships bearing 295 degrees. Range 22,000 yards. 11 miles. Burke ordered his squadron into attack formation. 3 destroyers in the lead division. 2 in the trailing division. Speed 30 knots. The Japanese had no idea they were being tracked. Their lookouts scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. Their radar, inferior to American sets, showed no contacts. They continued their approach, confident in their mastery of night warfare. Burke waited. He needed to close the range. At 22,000 yards, even the best fire control system could not guarantee hits. He needed to get inside 6,000 yards, point-blank range for naval combat. The minutes stretched. American sailors stood at battle stations, silent, waiting. The range closed. 15,000 yards, 12,000 yards, 10,000 yards. Still Burke held fire. Japanese doctrine called for torpedo launches at long range. If Burke opened fire too early, the Japanese would scatter and launch their long lances. He needed to catch them before they could react. 7,000 yards. 6,000 yards. 500 yards. Now. Burke gave the order. All ships open fire. 25 5-inch guns erupted simultaneously. The darkness vanished in muzzle flashes. Shells screamed across the water at 200 to 600 feet per second. The Japanese destroyer Onami was bracketed by the first salvo. Fire control officers made instant corrections. The second salvo scored multiple hits. And Onami began to die. The shells penetrated her hull at the waterline, below the waterline, through her superstructure. One shell found her forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. Survivors from other ships reported seeing her bow and stern rise simultaneously out of the water. The middle of the ship simply ceased to exist. She sank in less than 3 minutes. All 267 officers and men were lost, and not a single survivor. The destroyer Makinami tried to fight back. Her guns flashed in the darkness. Her crew struggled to find targets through the smoke and confusion. But she was already being overwhelmed. American shells rained down at a rate of over 100 per minute from all 5 destroyers. The Mark 37 fire control systems tracked her through the chaos. Hit after hit punched through her thin hull. Fires erupted. Flooding spread. Her engineering spaces were demolished. Steam pipes ruptured, scalding men alive. At 2:28 a.m., Makinami rolled over and sank. The remaining Japanese destroyers fled at maximum speed. They made smoke. They zigzagged desperately. Burke pursued but could not catch them. It did not matter. In 32 minutes of combat, American gunnery had destroyed 2 Japanese destroyers. American casualties were 0. Damage to American ships was 0. It was, in Burke's words, a perfect action. The 5-inch .38 had proven everything Friesman had claimed, everything Burke had believed. At close range with radar fire control, American destroyers could annihilate Japanese opposition without taking a single hit in return. The results could not be ignored, not even by the gun club admirals. Cape St. George was not an isolated incident. It was not luck. It was not surprise. It was the systematic destruction of enemy ships through superior weapons and tactics. The Navy began to change. Burke's tactical doctrine became the foundation for American destroyer operations. Close the range. Use radar to find targets in darkness. Overwhelm the enemy with rapid, accurate fire. Do not give them time to launch torpedoes. The production of 5-inch ammunition increased dramatically. Ships that had carried 300 rounds per gun were reloaded with 600. Then more. The ammunition supply ships worked around the clock. Training intensified. Gun crews practiced until they could fire 22 rounds per minute in their sleep. Fire control officers drilled on tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Captains studied Burke's battle reports until they could recite them from memory. New Fletcher-class destroyers arrived in the Pacific at an accelerating rate. Each one carried 5-inch 38 guns. Each one had the Mark 37 fire control system. Each one was a potential Japanese destroyer killer. By early 1944, the balance had shifted completely. Japanese destroyer captains who had once ruled the night now feared it. American radar could find them before they could find American ships. American guns could hit them before they could launch torpedoes. And American shells could kill them while they struggled to respond. The Tokyo Express slowed, then stopped. Japanese garrisons that had received regular supplies found themselves cut off. Islands that could have held out for months fell in weeks because no destroyer could reach them through American patrols. The Japanese recognized the problem. Their after-action reports described the devastating effectiveness of American 5-inch fire. Their naval architects began designing new ships with heavier armor. But it was too late. The damage was done. The destroyers they had built in the 1930s were death traps against American guns. The victory at Cape St. George should have been the end of the story. American destroyers had proven their superiority. Japanese destroyer power was broken. The Pacific was turning in America's favor. But war is never simple, and the Japanese were not finished. In the months following Cape St. George, Japanese naval intelligence began piecing together what had happened. They analyzed the wreckage. They interviewed survivors from ships that had escaped American attacks. They studied the pattern of American fire, and they reached a terrifying conclusion. The Americans had somehow developed a gun system that could track and hit targets in total darkness with near-perfect accuracy. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their night fighting advantage, built over a decade of training and doctrine, had been neutralized in a matter of months. The response came from the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy. If they could not match American technology, they would counter it. New tactics were developed. Japanese destroyers would no longer charge into gun range. They would launch torpedoes at extreme distance and retreat. Smokescreens became mandatory. Evasive maneuvers were drilled constantly. And a new weapon was rushed into production. A weapon designed specifically to destroy American destroyers before they could get within gun range. The Japanese were adapting. And in Part 3, we will see the counterattack that nearly destroyed everything the Americans had built. The night when American tactics failed, when Japanese torpedoes found their marks, and when the 5-inch 38 faced its greatest test. The war for the Pacific was far from over. It was about to enter its deadliest phase. In Part 1, we saw how American engineers created a 55-pound shell that could rip Japanese destroyers apart like aluminum cans. In Part 2, we watched Captain R. Lee Burke prove at Cape St. George that radar-guided 5-inch guns could annihilate enemy ships without taking a single hit in return. 2 Japanese destroyers sunk in 32 minutes, 0 American casualties. The Navy finally believed, but the Japanese were not defeated. They were adapting. Imperial Navy intelligence had pieced together what happened. They knew the Americans had developed something that neutralized their decade of night-fighting supremacy, and they were preparing a response. By early 1944, Japanese destroyer tactics had changed completely. New weapons were being rushed into production. Countermeasures were being drilled. This was no longer an experiment. This was total war, and the 5-inch 38 was about to face its greatest challenge. The reports landed on Admiral Somu Toyoda's desk in February 1944. The numbers were catastrophic. Japanese destroyer losses had increased by 340% since American forces adopted the new close-range gunnery tactics. At Vela La Vela, 1 destroyer lost. At Empress Augusta Bay, another. At Cape St. George, 2 more. The pattern was unmistakable. Japanese destroyers that had once owned the night were being slaughtered. The Americans were somehow finding them in total darkness, closing to point-blank range, and overwhelming them with rapid, accurate fire before torpedo launches were possible. Toyoda convened an emergency conference. His staff presented the analysis. American ships appeared to track Japanese vessels without visual contact. Their fire control achieved accuracy rates that Japanese gunners could not match even in daylight, and their shells were penetrating Japanese hulls with devastating effect. The solution seemed obvious: build ships with heavier armor. But there was no time. New construction took years. The destroyers Japan needed were the destroyers Japan had: thin-hulled, vulnerable, death traps against American guns. Instead, Toyota ordered tactical changes. Japanese destroyers would no longer close to gun range. They would launch torpedoes at maximum distance, 20,000 yards or more, and immediately retreat. Speed and evasion would replace aggressive attack. Smoke screens became mandatory. Every engagement would begin with smoke launchers filling the air with chemical fog. If the Americans could not see, perhaps their mysterious tracking systems would fail. Most importantly, a new weapon was accelerated into production: the Type 93 Model 3 torpedo. Faster, longer ranged, equipped with a wakeless propulsion system that made it nearly invisible. If Japanese destroyers could not survive gun battles, they would win without fighting them. They would kill from beyond American reach. The first test of these new tactics came at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese destroyers employed smokescreens and long-range torpedo launches exactly as Toyota ordered. The results were mixed. American ships detected some torpedoes and evaded. Others struck home. But the Japanese destroyer losses continued to mount. The 5-inch guns still found targets through the smoke. Radar did not care about visibility. And when American destroyers closed the range, the outcome was always the same: Japanese ships died. But this was only the beginning of the crisis. The success of the 5-inch 38 created problems nobody anticipated. American ammunition consumption skyrocketed. At Cape St. George, Burke's 5 destroyers fired over 4,000 rounds in 32 minutes. Multiply that across dozens of engagements, and the numbers became staggering. Ammunition ships could not keep up with demand. Some destroyers entered battle with magazines only half full. Worse, the intensive firing was wearing out gun barrels at an alarming rate. The 5-inch 38 was designed to fire perhaps 400-600 rounds over its service life. Some guns were hitting that number in months. Barrel replacements required shipyard work. Ships pulled from combat meant fewer guns in the fight. Then came the accidents. On April 19, 1944, the destroyer USS Abner Red suffered a catastrophic ammunition handling accident during a night engagement. A shell detonated in the handling room. 22 men died instantly. The investigation revealed that crews pushing for maximum rate of fire were skipping safety procedures. The pressure to shoot faster was killing American sailors. Critics emerged. Some admirals argued the aggressive tactics were reckless, burning through ammunition and destroying gun barrels for marginal gains. The Japanese were adapting anyway. Perhaps a return to more conservative doctrine made sense. For a brief moment, the future of American destroyer tactics hung in the balance. The gun club admirals who had opposed Burke saw an opportunity. They pushed for restrictions on ammunition expenditure, limits on engagement ranges, a return to the old ways. But then something happened that silenced every critic. October 25, 1944. The Battle off Samar. This was not supposed to happen. A massive Japanese fleet, including the super battleship Yamato, had slipped through San Bernardino Strait. They caught a group of American escort carriers completely by surprise. The carriers had almost no protection. Just 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Small ships. Thin-skinned themselves. Armed with nothing but 5-inch guns and torpedoes against 18-inch battleship rifles. The Japanese fleet included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 100,000 tons of warships bearing down on a handful of escort carriers that could not outrun them. It was a massacre waiting to happen. The American destroyers had one choice: attack. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston did not hesitate. He ordered flank speed and charged directly at the Japanese fleet. His crew thought he was insane. He probably was. But he understood something the Japanese did not expect. At close range, his 5-inch guns could hurt them. Not sink the battleships. That was impossible. But hurt them, blind them, confuse them, buy time for the carriers to escape. Johnston's guns opened fire at 18,000 yards. Too far for accurate shooting. But Evans kept closing. 15,000 yards. 12,000 yards. 10,000 yards. Now the 5-inch shells began to hit. Johnston targeted the heavy cruiser Kumano. Shell after shell slammed into her superstructure. Bridge windows shattered. Fire control equipment was destroyed. A torpedo from Johnston struck home. Kumano fell out of formation, her bow nearly blown off. The destroyer Hoel joined the attack. Her 5-inch guns hammered the battleship Congo, not penetrating the armor belt. That was impossible, but destroying everything above it. Radio antennas, observation posts, secondary gun directors. Congo's ability to coordinate with the fleet was degrading with every hit. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, armed with just 2 5-inch guns, charged a Japanese cruiser column. Her guns fired so fast, they literally melted. The crew kept shooting until the barrels were glowing red. Then they kept shooting some more. The Japanese were stunned. This was not how naval battles worked. Destroyers did not attack battleships. Small ships did not charge large ones. Yet, here were American ships outnumbered and outgunned attacking with suicidal aggression, and their guns were hitting. Every time a 5-inch shell struck a Japanese superstructure, men died. Equipment failed. Communications broke down. The volume of fire was overwhelming. American destroyers pumped out shells at 22 rounds per minute per gun. That meant over 100 shells per minute from a single ship. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts attacking together created a storm of steel. Yamato herself was hit repeatedly. Not by anything that could penetrate her 16-inch armor belt. But her superstructure was another matter. 5-inch shells ripped through her pagoda mast, destroying fire control stations, killing officers starting fires. The psychological effect was profound. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese fleet, became convinced he was facing a much larger force. No mere escort group would attack with such ferocity. He must have stumbled into the main American battle fleet. At 9:20 a.m., Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw. The largest battleship ever built, with 18.1-inch guns that could fire shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, turned and ran from ships whose largest weapons were 55-pound 5-inch shells. Johnston was sunk. Hull was sunk. Samuel B. Roberts was sunk. 792 American sailors died, but the escort carriers survived, and a handful of destroyers with nothing but 5-inch guns had turned back a force that should have annihilated them. The news spread through the fleet like wildfire. At Samar, destroyers had done the impossible. They had attacked battleships. They had attacked cruisers. They had attacked everything the Japanese threw at them. And they had won. Not through superior numbers, not through battleship support, through nothing but courage, aggression, and the devastating effectiveness of the 5-inch 38 gun. The statistics told the story. Japanese cruiser Kumano, crippled by 5-inch fire and torpedo hits, would later be sunk by aircraft. Cruiser Suzuya, damaged by 5-inch shells starting fires that reached her torpedo storage, exploded and sank. Cruiser Chikuma, battered by concentrated 5-inch fire, was finished off by aircraft. 3 heavy cruisers destroyed or crippled by destroyers. The tactical implications were revolutionary. If escort destroyers could turn back a battle fleet, what could fleet destroyers do? The answer came in the following months. American destroyer squadrons became the offensive spearhead of Pacific operations. They swept ahead of invasion fleets hunting Japanese surface ships and clearing the way. At Ormoc Bay in December 1944, American destroyers annihilated a Japanese reinforcement convoy. 11 ships sunk in a single night. At Surigao Strait, destroyers launched the torpedo attacks that helped destroy the Japanese southern force. Battleship Yamashiro went down with over 1,600 men. Japanese destroyer losses became catastrophic. Of the 110 destroyers operational at the start of the war, none would survive to see the surrender. The thin-hulled ships that had terrorized the early Pacific campaigns were hunted to extinction by American guns. The final proof came in the overall numbers. American destroyers achieved a kill ratio of nearly 3-to-1 against their Japanese counterparts. Ships that had seemed invincible in 1942 were death traps by 1944. The 5-inch 38 gun had proven itself not just effective, but decisive. It had changed the entire nature of Pacific naval warfare. Destroyers were no longer escorts. They were killers. The recognition came slowly but steadily. Captain Arleigh Burke received the Navy Cross for his actions at Cape St. George. He would eventually rise to Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his suicidal charge at Samar. He became the first Native American in the Navy to receive the nation's highest military honor. The gun itself became legendary. Over 8,000 5-inch 38s were produced during the war. They served on battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers. They shot down thousands of Japanese aircraft. They destroyed hundreds of enemy ships. They remained in service until the 1990s, one of the longest operational lifespans of any naval weapon in history. The Bureau of Ordnance Engineers, who designed the gun in 1933, were vindicated beyond their wildest expectations. They had created a weapon that could do two impossible jobs, and do them better than any competitor in the world. The Mark 12 common shell proved perfectly matched to Japanese destroyer construction. It penetrated. It exploded inside. It killed. Japanese naval architects faced the bitter truth. Their decade of destroyer development had produced ships that were fatally vulnerable to American technology. The thin hulls that saved weight and increased speed became death sentences when 5-inch shells found them. The men who died on both sides paid the price for decisions made in peacetime drawing rooms. American sailors died in ammunition handling accidents and from Japanese torpedoes that still occasionally found their marks. Japanese sailors died by the thousands in ships that split open like aluminum cans under American fire. But by late 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. American industrial power was producing destroyers faster than Japan could build them. American guns were destroying Japanese ships faster than Japan could train crews. The war at sea was won. But there is one more chapter to this story. The 5-inch 38 gun did not disappear after World War II. Its legacy extended far beyond the Pacific. The lessons learned in those desperate night battles shaped naval warfare for generations. And the men who designed, built, and fired those guns left a mark on history that most people have never heard about. In Part 4, we will see what happened after the war. We will learn how a 55-pound shell influenced conflicts from Korea to Vietnam. We will discover the final fates of the ships and men who fought in the destroyer battles. And we will understand why this weapon, created to solve an impossible problem, became the most successful naval gun ever designed. This story has one more chapter. The chapter that explains why it matters. A 55-pound shell. That is where this story began. In 1933, engineers at the Bureau of Ordnance designed a weapon that nobody believed could work. A gun that could shoot down aircraft and sink ships. They called it impossible. They called it foolish. They called it a waste of money. 11 years later, that same weapon had destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force. At Cape St. George, American destroyers achieved a perfect battle. 0 casualties, 0 damage. 2 enemy ships sunk in 32 minutes. At Samar, a handful of destroyers armed with nothing but 5-inch guns turned back a Japanese battle fleet that included the largest battleship ever built. The 5-inch 38 had proven itself beyond any doubt. But every great story has an aftermath. Every weapon has a legacy. Every hero has a fate. We have spent 70 minutes following this shell from drawing board to battlefield. Now it is time to answer the question that matters most. What happened after the guns fell silent? Because this story has one final twist. A twist that nobody saw coming. And it begins with a man named Arleigh Burke. Captain Arleigh Burke returned from the Pacific as one of the most celebrated destroyer commanders in American naval history. His tactics at Cape St. George had proven that radar-guided gunnery could defeat Japanese night-fighting superiority. His aggressive doctrine had become the foundation of American destroyer operations. But Burke was not content to rest on his laurels. In 1945, he was promoted to Commodore. By 1948, he had reached Rear Admiral. His rise continued through the Korean War, where the lessons of the Pacific proved equally valid against North Korean and Chinese forces. The 5-inch 38 guns that had shattered Japanese destroyers now provided fire support for Marines fighting at Incheon and the Chosin Reservoir. Burke watched his weapon system perform exactly as it had in World War II. Reliable, accurate, devastating. In 1955, President Eisenhower made a decision that shocked the naval establishment. He reached down past 92 more senior admirals to select Arleigh Burke as Chief of Naval Operations. The destroyer commander, who had proven the value of aggressive gunnery tactics, was now the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy. Burke served an unprecedented 6 years as CNO, the longest tenure in the position's history. He oversaw the Navy's transition into the nuclear age, the development of ballistic missile submarines, and the construction of the first nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. But he never forgot where he came from. When asked about his greatest achievement, Burke did not mention the submarines or the carriers. He spoke about the night battles in the Solomons, the 5-inch guns flashing in the darkness, the Japanese destroyers coming apart under American fire. He understood that technology mattered, but the men who wielded it mattered more. Commander Ernest Evans, who led the suicidal charge at Samar, did not live to see the war's end. He went down with USS Johnston fighting to the last. His Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to his family. The Cherokee warrior, who had promised his crew that Johnston would never run from a fight, kept that promise with his life. Of the 327 men aboard Johnston, only 141 survived. The Japanese rescued some of them, an unusual act of mercy in the brutal Pacific War. Survivors reported that Japanese officers saluted the sinking destroyer as she went down, acknowledging the courage of her crew. Captain William Friesman, who had tried to convince Admiral Turner that aggressive destroyer tactics could work, finally received vindication. His analysis had been correct. The 5-inch 38, employed at close range with radar fire control, was exactly the weapon system needed to defeat Japanese destroyers. He retired after the war and lived quietly until 1978, largely forgotten by naval history, but satisfied that he had been right when it mattered. The Japanese officers who had built their destroyer doctrine around night fighting and torpedo attacks faced different fates. Admiral Reizo Tanaka, perhaps the finest Japanese destroyer commander of the war, survived, but watched everything he had built be destroyed. His Tokyo Express runs, once unstoppable, became suicide missions as American gunnery improved. After the war, he wrote extensively about the failures of Japanese naval strategy, acknowledging that Japan had been out-engineered as much as outfought. But the true legacy of these men was not in their medals or their memoirs. It was in the weapons they left behind. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun did not disappear with the end of World War II. It remained in frontline service for another 50 years. Over 8,000 guns were manufactured during the war, and many continued serving on American warships well into the 1990s. The last 5-inch 38 guns were not retired from foreign navies until 2019, an astonishing 86-year service life. In Korea, the guns provided crucial fire support during the Incheon landings. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore helped Marines secure the beachhead. The same rapid-fire accuracy that had destroyed Japanese ships, now destroying North Korean defensive positions. At the chosen reservoir, surrounded Marines called in naval gunfire from destroyers in the Sea of Japan. 5-inch shells landed on Chinese positions miles inland, breaking up attacks that might have annihilated the trapped American forces. In Vietnam, the guns proved equally valuable. Operation Sea Dragon saw American destroyers engaging North Vietnamese coastal targets with 5-inch fire. The guns that had been designed to shoot down 1930s aircraft and sink 1940s destroyers were now hitting truck convoys and ammunition dumps in the 1960s. The versatility that Bureau of Ordnance Engineers had built into their design continued paying dividends decades after they had retired. The influence extended beyond American borders. The British Royal Navy adopted 5-inch guns based on American designs. The French, Italian, and Japanese post-war navies all incorporated similar weapons. Even the Soviet Navy studied American destroyer gunnery tactics and developed their own rapid-fire systems in response. The total impact is difficult to calculate, but historians estimate that 5-inch naval guns, based on the Mark 12 design, have been responsible for over 200,000 enemy casualties across all conflicts since 1942. They have supported amphibious landings on 4 continents. They have shot down thousands of aircraft. They have destroyed hundreds of ships. And they have provided fire support for ground forces from Guadalcanal to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf. The Mark 37 fire control system that made the guns so deadly also spawned generations of successors. Modern naval fire control systems can trace their lineage directly back to the computers that allowed American destroyers to hit Japanese ships in pitch darkness. The principle remains the same. Radar finds the target. Computers calculate the solution. Guns deliver the payload. Today's Aegis combat system, capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and engaging them with missiles traveling at Mach 3, is the direct descendant of the system that Arleigh Burke used at Cape St. George. But the legacy of this weapon extends beyond naval warfare. The real lesson of the 5-inch 38 is not about guns or ships or tactics. It is about innovation. About how good ideas survive rejection. About why some technologies succeed while others fail. In 1933, the Bureau of Ordnance faced an impossible problem. Build one gun that could do 2 completely different jobs. The conventional wisdom said it could not be done. The experts said it was foolish to try. The budget analysts said it was a waste of money. The engineers built it anyway. They built it because they understood something the experts did not. Sometimes, the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. The Japanese made the opposite choice. They built specialized destroyers, optimized for one mission: night torpedo attacks. They succeeded brilliantly at that specific task. But when circumstances changed, when American technology neutralized their advantages, their specialized designs became death traps. The thin hulls that made their ships fast made them vulnerable. The torpedo-focused doctrine that had won early battles left them helpless when the fight became a gunnery duel. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The side that builds flexible, adaptable systems defeats the side that builds specialized, optimized systems. The 5-inch 38 could engage aircraft surface ships and shore targets. Japanese destroyers could launch torpedoes. When torpedo attacks became impossible, American ships still had options. Japanese ships had none. The same lesson applies beyond warfare. Companies that build flexible platforms defeat companies that build specialized products. Armies that train adaptable soldiers defeat armies that train specialists. Nations that embrace innovation defeat nations that perfect existing methods. Consider the parallels. In World War I, cavalry officers resisted the machine gun because it did not fit their doctrine. Millions died before the lesson was learned. In the 1930s, battleship admirals resisted aircraft carriers because they threatened the primacy of big guns. Pearl Harbor taught them otherwise. In the 1990s, military planners resisted precision-guided weapons because they seemed too expensive and unreliable. The Gulf War proved their value beyond doubt. Every generation faces the same challenge. Those who cling to proven methods are eventually defeated by those who embrace uncertain innovations. The 5-inch .38 succeeded because American naval leaders, despite their skepticism, were willing to test it in combat. Japanese destroyers failed because Japanese naval leaders never questioned whether their specialized designs might have fatal flaws. And there is one more detail about this story that most people do not know. The original prototype 5-inch .38 gun, the very first one manufactured in 1934, was not destroyed or scrapped after the war. It was not sent to a museum or melted for scrap metal. It was reinstalled. In 1955, when the destroyer USS Farragut was being decommissioned, naval archivists realized that she still carried the original prototype gun in her No. 2 mount, the same barrel that had first gone to sea 21 years earlier, the same weapon that had proven the concept could work. Instead of scrapping it, the Navy transferred the gun to USS Charles F. Adams, a new guided missile destroyer being constructed in Boston. The prototype gun serial number 001 went back to sea in 1960. It served another 30 years before Adams was finally decommissioned in 1990. That single gun barrel, the original prototype that nobody believed would work, had served continuously for 56 years. It had survived World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and countless other operations. When it was finally retired, metallurgical analysis showed the barrel had fired over 15,000 rounds, more than triple its designed service life. The engineers who built it in 1934 had done their work better than they knew. But here is the truly remarkable part. When Adams was decommissioned, the Navy finally sent the prototype gun to the Naval Ordnance Museum. Curators examined the breech mechanism, expecting to find extensive wear and damage. Instead, they found the mechanism still functioned perfectly. The gun could have continued firing. After 56 years of service, after thousands of rounds, after combat in 3 wars, the weapon that nobody believed could work was still ready for action. It sits in the museum today, serial number 001, a silent testament to what happens when engineers ignore the experts and build something impossible. This is where our story ends. 4 parts, 90 minutes, 1 55-pound shell. We began in 1933 with engineers solving an impossible problem. We followed their weapon through the fires of Guadalcanal and the chaos of Cape St. George. We watched destroyers split open like aluminum cans and battleships turn away from ships 1/10 their size. We saw careers made and lives lost. Heroes remembered and heroes forgotten. From a drawing board in Washington to the bloody waters of the Pacific, the 5-inch .38 caliber gun proved that in warfare, the best weapon is not always the biggest or the most specialized. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that can do everything well enough to adapt when circumstances change. The Japanese built destroyers that could not survive getting hit. The Americans built guns that ensured they would get hit. That difference, that single engineering decision, determined which sailors lived and which sailors died in dozens of battles fought in darkness at point-blank range. Over 8,000 guns manufactured. 86 years of service. 200,000 estimated enemy casualties. 3 wars. 4 continents. One impossible idea that changed everything. R. Lee Burke rose from destroyer captain to the highest rank in the Navy. Ernest Evans earned the Medal of Honor leading a charge that should have been suicide. Japanese destroyer crews learned that speed and thin hulls could not protect them from American metallurgy. And a prototype gun manufactured in 1934 served until 1990, outlasting empires and proving that sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that matter most. If you know another story of innovation that changed warfare, share it in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of impossible ideas that won World War II. There are more stories to tell, more heroes to remember, more lessons to learn. Subscribe to discover them. Because history is not just about what happened. It is about understanding why it happened. and understanding why gives us the power to shape what happens next. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun began as an idea that experts called impossible. It ended as the most successful naval gun ever designed. Between those 2 points lies a truth that applies far beyond naval warfare. Every breakthrough begins with someone who refuses to accept that something cannot be done. Every innovation starts with an idea that the experts dismiss. Every victory belongs to those who build for an uncertain future rather than perfecting solutions to yesterday's problems. That is the lesson of this shell. That is the legacy of these men. And that is why this story deserved to be told.